Today we're continuing on with our lessons in solving quadratic equations. So we're still solving quadratic equations, which means we're really trying to find those x-intercepts. By now we already know, what else can we call x-intercepts? The zeros. What else can we call zeros? The roots. So we're still solving for those zeros. We're still solving for those roots. I've got my 3 graphs here with 3 different examples of the types of solutions we might find. So for example, we might find a graph that has, or a parabola that has 2 real solutions or 2 real zeros. We might find a parabola that has only 1 real zero. And then what about when we have a parabola that doesn't hit the x-axis on the real number line at all? Well then, we know that we have 2 imaginary zeros. To help us find those imaginary zeros, we have to use the imaginary number I. And this is a fun fact that you need to have memorized for the rest of this school year and for Algebra 2 especially. We're going to use the imaginary number I a lot in Algebra 2. So what we know about I is that it does in fact exist, even though it's called imaginary. We know that I squared is equal to -1, and therefore the square root of -1 is equal to I. We need I to exist so that we can take the square root of negative numbers. Without it, we can't simplify the square root of negative numbers. So now we're going to do 3 examples, just like we did in the last video in our notes earlier this week, and we're going to solve 3 different quadratic equations that have complex solutions. So let's keep using that quadratic formula, just because it's kind of like the easiest and most efficient to use, especially when we have imaginary zeros. So x squared minus 6x plus 12 is equal to 0. Let's plug that into our quadratic formula. X equals the negative of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. So negative 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times 12 all over 2 times a, so 2 times 1. X is equal to positive 6 plus or minus the square root. Negative 6 squared is 36. Negative 4 times 1 is negative 4 times 12 is negative 48. All over 2 times 1, which is 2. So x is equal to 6 plus or minus the square root of 36 minus 48 is negative 12, all over 2. So x is equal to 6 plus or minus the square root of, I'm going to rewrite negative 12 as negative 1 times 12, all over 2. Let's come up here. So x is equal to 6 plus or minus the square root of, negative 1 can be replaced with I squared, and then 12 is really 4 times 3. So when we simplify this, we have x is equal to 6 plus or minus the square root, oh, just kidding. I can simplify my square root. What's the square root of I squared? I. What's the square root of 4? 2. So 2I times root, and we still have 3 under the radical, all over 2. So to simplify these fractions, I need to break it up into 2 fractions. So 6 over 2 plus or minus 2I root 3 over 2. So we have to divide both parts by 2. So 6 over 2 simplifies to 3, plus or minus 2I divided by 2 is just I, and then we still have root 3. So our solutions are x equals 3 plus or minus I root 3. So why don't you go ahead and pause the video and try out example 2 and example 3 on your own, and then press play when you're ready to check your work and go over them together. So for example 2, some of you may have noticed that 10x squared, negative 4x, and 10 are all divisible by 2. And you can divide this whole equation by 2, and then you would have 5x squared minus 2x plus 5 equals 0, which is a lot easier to deal with. But I'm going to stick with the numbers that are in the original equation just for the sake of confusion and trying to avoid that. So let's plug this into the quadratic formula. X equals the negative of negative 4 plus or minus the square root of negative 4 squared minus 4 times 10 times 10 all over 2 times 10. The negative of negative 4 is positive 4, plus or minus negative 4 squared is 16. Negative 4 times 10 is negative 40. Negative 40 times 10 is negative 400. All over 2 times 10, which is 20. So then we have 4 plus or minus the square root. 16 minus 400 is negative 384 all over 20. X is equal to 4 plus or minus. This is going to be negative 1 times 384. So we're going to replace negative 1 with, you guessed it, I squared. And then 384 can be divided by 4. So 4 times 96 all over 20. X is equal to 4 plus or minus the square root. So the square root of I squared is I. The square root of 4 is 2. And then what about 96? Can we divide 96 by 4? Yeah, we get 4 times 24. And then 24 can actually be broken down further to 4 times 6. And hey, I got a group of 2 4s that we can bring out in front. So we got to be careful when we bring this out. So we're bringing it out in front, which means we're multiplying the 2i by this 4. So 2i times 4 would be 8i, root 6 all over 20. Then we need to simplify our fraction here. So we're going to have 4 over 20 plus or minus 8i, root 6 over 20. So I can divide 4 and 20 by 4. That's going to simplify to 1 and 5. So x is equal to 1/5 plus or minus, and then 8 divided by 4 is 2, 20 divided by 4 is 5, so 2i root 6 over 5. That's our final answer. Moving on to example 3. So I tried to trick you with example 3 because this equation is not equal to 0, and whenever we solve a quadratic equation, the very first step is to always make sure it's equal to 0. So we actually have to move the 2x and the 5 to the other side. So we're going to have 5x squared minus 2x plus 5 is equal to 2x minus 2x is 0. Negative 5 plus 5 is 0, so it's equal to 0. Let's go ahead and plug this into the quadratic formula. X equals the negative of negative 2 plus or minus the square root of negative 2 squared minus 4 times a times c, so 5 times 5. All over 2 times a, so 2 times 5. X is equal to, the negative of negative 2 is 2, plus or minus the square root of negative 2 squared is 4, and then negative 4 times 5 is negative 20, and then negative 20 times 5 is negative 100. All over 2 times 5, which is 10. So x is equal to 2 plus or minus square root of negative 96 all over 10. We're going to rewrite that as x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of negative 1 times 96. Of course, we're going to replace that negative 1 with I squared. And then 96 can be broken down to, didn't we just figure out that 96 was 24 times 4 or 4 times 6? 4 times 4 times 6, right? Let's see, 96 divided by 16. Yeah, so 16 times 6 all over 10. So x is equal to 2 plus or minus The square root of 16 is 4. The square root of I squared is I, root 6, all over 10. We're going to break that apart into two separate fractions, 2/10 plus or minus 4I root 6 over 10, and then simplify those fractions. So x is equal to, both of these divide by 5, so this becomes 1 and this becomes 2. Just kidding. Both of these are not divisible by 5. They're both divisible by 2. So 2 divided by 2 is 1, and 10 divided by 2 is 5. Sorry for misspeaking. So 1/5 plus or minus. And then 4 divided by 2 is 2. 10 divided by 2 is 5. So this becomes 2I root 6 over 5. And we're done for the day.